in and out, then back through venules and veins to the heart. While we are in the capillaries, though, we have some interesting questions to ask. One of the main ones is this. In all capillaries, other than the blood-brain barrier, and even that to some degree, water can freely move into and out of the capillary. So which way is it going to go? Into or out? Depends on what?
The water.
The solutes, why would they make a difference?
The amount of water.
The amount of water? Let's get as specific as we can. What physical phenomena that we've talked about? Osmosis might play a part. Pressure might play a part. Things move from high to low pressure. So, what we're going to spend some time here on is, why would water go into or out of a continuous capillary? Which is a phenomenon we call bulk flow. So let's imagine we've got an arteriole leading to a capillary which leads to a venule. So here we've got this capillary. We want to determine whether water is going to cross that membrane from the tissue into the blood, or from the blood into the tissue, both, or neither, or what. And people suggested a couple of things which might affect it: osmosis and regular pressure. Let's talk about that osmosis part. What would affect the osmosis? What would make water more likely to go into a vessel versus out of a vessel? Solute concentration. Yeah. And in the blood, there's a couple things that take part in that: salts, electrolytes, and proteins. Of course, in a continuous capillary, the electrolytes, the salts, can travel in and out at the leaky junctions. So they will tend to diffuse until they have equal concentration. The salt concentration in the extracellular fluid and the blood plasma are going to be very similar. If there's more salt in here than out here, the salt's just going to diffuse through those leaky junctions. So that's not going to be a part of it. Is there anything else that's differently distributed? Say plasma, 92% water, 1% other, including electrolytes. What's the other 7%? Can protein cross these walls?
No.
No. So, if I've got a lot of protein in the plasma and not out here because it can't leave, that creates an osmotic difference. The presence of the plasma proteins in here gives water a reason to go into the blood vessel overall. You can express the tendency of something to move by osmosis as equivalent to a pressure. What we find is that the inward osmotic pressure what we call colloid osmotic pressure. You might also see this called oncotic pressure. Is equivalent to about 25 millimeters of mercury. And it's about constant over the length of the capillary. So over this capillary, the presence of those proteins exerts an osmotic pull on water, tending to bring water in. So if this were the only thing affecting water movement, as our blood went through the tissues, it would suck all the water out of our tissues and leave us all shriveled and give us a lot more blood volume, which will lead to a lot higher blood pressure. This is not what happens, which suggests that there are some other forces acting on it. The main other one is the simple fact that this blood is under pressure. Some of the pressure that was there in the arteries is still there, pushing outward on the wall of the artery. Have any of you ever worked with a sprinkler hose? A hose that has little holes drilled in it so it gives out water?
Mm-hmm.
If you plug one of those into a hose tap and you turn it on, the water starts spraying out of it, right? Why? Yeah, there's pressure in the hose. The water pressure in your house pipes is transmitted into that hose, pushing outward. If there are places for the water to get out, it will push it out. This is similar. The blood in here is under pressure, so the plasma is being pressed against the walls, and if water can leave, it will. So the outward hydrostatic pressure this is just blood pressure. Is about 35 millimeters of mercury on the arterial side of the capillary. But pressure diminishes as you get farther from the heart. On the other end of the capillary, the outward pressure is down to about 15 millimeters of mercury. So it's diminishing as we go along. From 35 to about 15. So which way is water going to go?
Out.
Why do you say out? It's a 50% chance. Yeah, let's look at it place by place. Here, there's more pressure pushing out than pushing in. So overall, the pressure is outward, water's movement overall will be out. Now I'm putting that arrow down, but the important thing is that it's out. Make sense? We're okay on that? Okay. What about here? Still going to be out, but not quite as much. Some of the hydrostatic pressure is gone. Colloid osmotic pressure isn't really any different. So there's still a tendency to go out, but it's weaker. What about here? Yeah, they're roughly equal. So here, water's probably moving equally inward and outward. And here, a little bit in, and here, strongly in.
Does that one push up a bit or no?
But this one?
No, the board itself. Thank you.
So over here, the water has an overall tendency to leave the vessel, which we call filtration. Over here has a tendency to enter, which we call absorption. So what do you think overall? Is water entering or leaving this capillary? This diagram makes it look like they're perfectly balanced. And we'll lose a little water over here and gain it over there, and everyone's fine. And it's close, but not quite. In actuality, if you were to average all the blood vessels in the body, you would find that for most of them, they filter just a little more than they absorb. The break-even point is a little bit down that way. So that in general, capillaries filter a tiny bit more water than they pick up. Which means overall, we're losing a little bit of water to the tissue. if you were to add up all of the excess filtration through the body, you'd get about 3 liters per day. You move about 3 liters of water each day from your blood into your tissue as extracellular fluid. This is where extracellular fluid comes from. It's filtered blood plasma, water and electrolytes from the blood, minus the proteins. But 3 liters is pretty close to your total plasma volume. So over the course of the day, all of the plasma leaves your blood and you're left with sort of a sludgy mass in your blood vessels, right? Of course not. So how do we get that fluid back? Your tissues can't absorb 3 liters a day either. You're going to swell up. If I say you look like the Michelin Man, does anybody have any idea what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel old sometimes. So,
So it doesn't have something to do with the kidneys?
the kidneys filter blood, but once the fluid is out in the tissues, the kidneys can't do anything with it. But the lymphatic system can. So, unbeknownst to most, but now knownst to you, there are vessels in your tissues that are much like sinusoidal capillaries in that they have gaps in their walls. But they're dead-end vessels. These are the first lymph vessels, lymphatic capillaries. And as we gradually add fluid to the tissue, as we filter out water and electrolytes and make extracellular fluid, the lymphatic capillaries absorb that. But not just that, they also absorb dead cells, debris, bacteria, viruses, whatever else is in the tissues. All of the gunk and sludge gets taken up by these lymphatic capillaries. They are the sewage drains. Those lymphatic capillaries will carry that fluid, which we call lymph, to a series of lymph nodes, little encapsulated tiny organs where multiple lymph vessels will come together. The lymph will move through the lymph node and then come out on the other side a little bit cleaner. Lymph nodes are full of immune cells, a lot of macrophages, some other things. So as the gunk moves through here, these cells will engulf it, digest it, and release the materials so that we end up with cleaner and cleaner lymph. After you've been through a bunch of lymph nodes, you end up with stuff that is not that dissimilar from blood plasma, which is returned to your blood up here under your collarbones. So this is your sewage system. It takes old extracellular fluid, cleans it up, and puts it back into your blood.
Pretty much everything you said, bacteria, cells, virus, everything.
Your dead cells, pieces of stuff, invaders, whatever. The lymph nodes have a lot of immune cells, a lot of macrophages, for example. So that as the lymph is moving through the lymph node, anything in there, any materials, will end up bumping into a macrophage, getting engulfed and broken down.
I'm sorry, where did you say it returns to?
Returns to some major blood vessels up here under the collarbones.
And then from there they go to an artery?
It's actually
Or
dumping
a
into some
vein?
veins up here. The final lymph vessels just dump
into the
directly
vein.
into the veins.
Okay.
So it's a recycling system. When people are ill, when there's battles going on in their tissue, there's usually extra debris and extra stuff. The lymph nodes can get clogged and they can get swollen. So one of the things you might feel when you're ill, in the places where you find lymph nodes, around your neck, breast, around the abdomen, you may find swollen little hard nodules. Those are probably overworked lymph nodes. If they get to be a problem and they actually become a source of infection, you may have to have them removed. But in general, they'll go back to normal after a while. The other fun thing about this is you may have heard of a condition called elephantiasis, which is caused by a parasite infecting the lymph vessels and lodging in them and blocking them. So if you block, say, all of the lymphatic drainage from your arm, you keep getting extracellular fluid, but it has nowhere to go, and your arm swells. So it can cause extreme swelling of the extremities.
Okay, so it, from the lymphatic system and the lymph nodes, they do all this cleaning. The clean fluid gets dumped into the veins, directly to the veins. When is it ECF exactly?
It's extracellular fluid before it's in the lymphatic system. So when it's just in the tissues out
And
here,
it's been coming out and
Yep.
that needs to get reabsorbed.
that's extracellular fluid. Human juice, we'll call it that. Ah, come on, I like that. Okay. All right. Yeah. There's one other thing I was going to tell you about on here. Oh, yeah. We'll do blood pressure in lab. There was one. Nah, you know what? Never mind. It won't be on the test. Maybe I'll put it on the website in case anyone's interested. When we talked briefly about cardiac output, about EDB, ESV, and stroke volume. There's some interesting stuff about that that has to do with phenomena like congestive heart failure, which has to do with imbalanced cardiac output between the left and right ventricle and the buildup of pressure in areas. It's not going to be on the exam, but maybe I'll put up a summary in case anyone wants a starting place to look if they're interested. But right now, let's start on blood pressure and then we'll finish it in the other room. When you go to the doctor, it seems like the first thing they do is slap a blood pressure cuff on you. Because blood pressure is one of those important numbers, relatively easy to get, that can tell you something about your overall health. So right now, let's talk about the idea in general. So I want you to imagine a set of pipes with two valves that we can tighten or loosen. This section in the middle is made of elastic material that can stretch. So we're going to have fluid moving through this pipe out this way, moving through that middle. Now I would like you to tell me, if I tighten that valve somewhat, what will happen to the elastic material here? It will balloon outward. Why?
Because the pressure goes up.
Pressure, okay, so since the fluid is moving this way, we have to assume that there's more pressure over here than over there. There's some amount of difference in pressure here. So why is it that if I tighten that up, pressure increases here?
Because you stop it from going out.
Okay, so I've got a certain amount of fluid coming into here, but I'm limiting how quickly it can leave, which causes it to build up, which will raise the pressure. What happens to the pressure down here?
Gets lower.
Okay, so if I'm increasing the pressure here, it's going to decrease there. Okay, I agree. Now, if I've got this tightened up so this is all swollen, and now I tighten this valve, what will happen in here?
It'll stay the same.
It'll stay inflated?
What are you
Tighten it.
This is not completely shut off. There is some fluid that can still flow
Is
through.
the other one completely shut off?
Let's say it is.
So then it'll slowly drain.
Okay, so if I shut this one completely, then gradually this one will drain. As there is some pressure here, nothing coming in here, and lower pressure there, so this fluid will drain out. Presumably these walls will shrink back. There's probably some level I could tighten this to that still allows a little flow that would allow this to gradually decompress. So what we're getting from here is that pressure in a given area fundamentally depends on two things. How much flow is going into that area and how much flow is going out. How easily is a fluid entering the area and how easily is it leaving. So when I talk about arterial pressure, pressure in my arteries, that's going to come from how much blood is entering my arteries versus how easily it is leaving my arteries. What's the thing that puts blood into the arteries? The heart, yeah, the ventricles of the heart. So one major component of arterial pressure will be cardiac output. So we're looking at flow in versus flow out. Cardiac output is flow in for the arteries. So if I don't change anything and I increase my cardiac output, I don't change anything else, what happens to my arterial pressure? More blood flowing into the arteries, no change in the amount that can leave. Pressure should go up. If I decrease cardiac output, pressure should fall. So that part is simple enough. What determines flow out from the arteries, though?
Maybe the muscle around it.
The muscle around the artery itself is actually more about applying additional pressure to the blood there. One of the main things, the reasons for you have that smooth muscle and the elastic tissue is this. When the heart is in diastole, when the ventricles have stopped pumping, the semilunars are closed, for that moment, my cardiac output is 0. Why does my blood keep moving in the arteries? Doesn't it, the pressure now applied by the heart is nothing. So doesn't it seem like it should go during systole, diastole? Systole, not skeletal so much. That affects veins, but not arteries very much. It's two things, really. The smooth muscle in the arteries is applying some pressure even when the heart isn't. And when I pushed blood into the arteries, those walls stretched, that elastic tissue stretched out. When I stop pushing blood in, what do you think is going to happen? That elastic tissue springs back. So if you've ever looked at blood flow in arteries, it does change speed, but it doesn't stop. It's systole, diastole, and it just slows down during diastole. But the arteries are continuing to apply pressure. In fact, when you measure arterial pressure, you measure two pressures, right? Mm-hmm. Systolic and diastolic. Systolic is the pressure, maximum pressure during the squeezing of the ventricle. Diastolic is the pressure that remains from the arteries themselves before the next heartbeat. That's actually also the pressure that you have to overcome to open the semilunar valves, which is an issue, but we'll get to that. So what's going to determine flow out? Well, what's the next vessel in line? Arteries, arterioles. How easily blood can leave the arteries depends mostly on the constriction of the smooth muscle in the arterioles, which we call peripheral resistance. All else being equal, if I tighten my arterioles overall, what should happen to my pressure in my arteries? Yeah, if I make it harder for blood to get out of the arteries, then pressure tends to go up. If I loosen my arterioles, pressure tends to go down. Blood pressure changes all the time. In lab, we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms our body uses to regulate it. But one thing that can cause problems with blood pressure is if all of your arterioles tighten up and stay just a little too constricted. That means if that happens, your blood pressure will tend to stay higher all the time. When we talk about clinical hypertension, blood pressure that's too high, which over time can cause damage. Some cases they call essential hypertension, meaning there is no obvious cause. One likely candidate for those is excessive peripheral resistance, which may be linked to a variety of things, including stress. Remember, sympathetic nervous system increases constriction of blood vessels. If your sympathetic nervous system is always a little active, if you're always under a little stress and it never really goes away, what can happen is the amount of constriction in your arterioles that your body regards as normal can change. It says, oh, this is the new normal. And that becomes your new set point, and your arterioles go back to that when you're not under stress. meaning your arterial pressure stays high all the time. Fixing that can be difficult. It's hard to change those set points. So, the body is well made for dealing with stress. The human body does very well with stress, assuming the stress goes away, you're done. Assuming that when you deal with it, now you're safe again. Doesn't look like it deals as well with stress that is just constant and never quite relieved, which unfortunately, of course, is what I'm doing to you in this class. Yes, I'm part of it too. So, let's take 15 minutes, meet in the other room, and we'll continue talking about blood pressure. The first part will be testable. I'll let you know when we're done with the testable part.